Welcome to Sunken Savings, a series where I'll cover a commander within a budget. These videos will be formatted a lot like the 1-3 lessons, but a little more loose when it comes to discussing the decklist and game plan. There are 3 rules. The price range cannot go over the TCG player estimate within the deck builder. Keep in mind, past the time of this video's upload, the deck price can possibly go up. The commander doesn't count towards the price. Basic lands also don't count towards the price. Before we continue, when it comes to selecting cards while on a budget, keep in mind different card arts or variants will be cheaper or more expensive. For instance, Ant Queen runs about $2 for the Modern Masters 2015 version, but a Bloomburrow Commander Ant Queen runs only about 30 cents. Grist, the Hunger Tide, makes for an excellent budget commander who today will be building within a $50 price range. At the time of this video, this deck will cost you roughly $48–49, besides the commander and basics of course. The reason why I think she works great with budget ties into her +1 ability, Insects. Insects are among Magic's weaker creature types, filling draft chaff, commons and uncommons aren't that expensive. It's a lot of fun getting to play some weird old insect cards that most players haven't seen, like Killer Bees and Fog and Gnats. Besides some outliers, our insects don't cause our budget to bug out. Instead, our budget lies with the non-basics and non-insects for the most part. Besides the $50 budget, this build is also centered around only creatures as another deck building restriction. You might be asking, why oops all creatures? I found that using the same instants and sorceries gets repetitive when it comes to playing with and against Grist, since the combo can be a bit tedious after you pulled it off enough times. Using only creatures isn't the best way to build Grist, or even budget Grist, but it does make it more unique. Before we go any further, let's cover our commander in more detail. Grist, the Hunger Tide, is a 3-mana, 1 generic black-green planeswalker. Now, normally planeswalkers cannot be your commander in EDH, but Grist's first text box says, as long as Grist, the Hunger Tide, isn't on the battlefield, it's a 1/1 insect creature in addition to its other types. This allows us to play Grist as our commander, since Grist is also technically a creature, which of course we can have in our command zone. Next, the +1 ability reads, create a 1/1 black and green insect creature token, then mill a card. If an insect card was milled this way, put a loyalty counter on Grist and repeat this process. Her -2, you may sacrifice a creature. When you do, destroy target creature or planeswalker. And finally, our main win condition and one of the builds around for the deck, her -5, which says, -5, each opponent loses life equal to the number of creature cards in your graveyard. To start with, her +1 ability is the biggest build around for the deck. It allows us to keep milling creatures from our library, assuming we keep hitting insects. It's a real gambler's high when you hit that chain of mill luckily, but I feel like it's a trap when it comes to building her. Relying on just this ability to fill our graveyard makes the deck weaker. If she were to be countered or removed a lot, locking us out would be our only mill option. Instead, I've mentioned it before and I'll cover it later, we have several mill and alternate win conditions via creatures in our deck to help alleviate Grist being our only way to win. But the downside is, the more non-insect creatures we include in the deck list, the worse her +1 ability becomes, and the lower her loyalty will climb. I still wanted a somewhat memey, but still able to win deck list using this commander, so that's why we're running just about 50 bugs and only creatures. Her -2 is nice, but besides having the removal on a stick, it's also great for getting some of our dredge creatures in the graveyard from the battlefield. I find myself not using this ability too often, but not rarely enough to forget it exists. Just be warned, if you keep removing people's commanders or high-valued creatures, there's a chance she'll take that arch-enemy title at the table, so just a heads up. -5 is our #1 way to win. Getting some lucky mills in a row can really boost her loyalty and her fill our yard, which leads to that sweet -5, burning the table for eventually a ton of damage. Even if she dies a bit too much in the early game, by using some of our mill enablers, we can fill our yard for a sneaky +1 to a -5 in the late game for that massive life loss. We'll next cover the majority of the deck, bugs, or specifically insects. Insects are a crucial part of any Grist deck, and this deck list is no exception. A whopping 51 insects, not including Grist, make up the most of our deck, more than the 30 lands we're running or the miscellaneous mill/value creatures. Are they exceptionally weak? Well, yes, they can be, but they're not as bad as you'd first think. We can deal with artifacts and enchantments relatively well with cards like Caustic Caterpillar, Caustic Wasps, Nantuko Vigilante, and Haywire Might. Caustic Wasps are especially scary since the repeatable artifact removal we can keep connecting. I love finding old cards like this that still have a real utility among all the other commander filler you usually see. Bane of the Living, we can morph for X black and give all creatures -X until end of turn. I'd like to point out this isn't our only morph creature, since we also have Nantuko Vigilante, we just mentioned, and Broodhatch Nantuko. A parallel I like to draw here is Foretell. When an opponent foretells a card, people usually assume it's Raven form. If you're using Saw It Coming, or Mystic Reflection, it can give you an advantage on interaction, and the same thing applies here. We can morph any one of these bugs, and our opponents have to respect either our board wipe, artifact or enchantment removal, or a chump blocker that can make us a ton of insect tokens. Not bad for cards that cost less than a quarter. Our main game plan is Grist, so naturally we need ways to protect her. Death Touchers of Stinging Cave Crawler, Bilious Skull Dweller, and tokens generated from Hornet Nest, just to name some that can make our opponents think twice before swinging in. Some bugs are surprisingly beefy. Vorapede with Undying, Giant Adaphage that can make tokens of itself when it connects, a cost-reduced Huskburster Swarm, and Stag Beetle. Stag Beetle is one of those older cards might have seen before, but in an insect deck list, but it gets X +1/+1 counters, where X is the number of other creatures on the field. This could be a huge amount from our board alone, considering the swarm we make between our commander and insects. Shame it lacks trample. We have some flyers to cover the air as well, like Fog of Gnats. It is unironically an amazing blocker, assuming the opponent doesn't have a trampler and with a single black mana to regenerate our gnats. Other flyers include Killer Bees, it's not very good, Swarm of Bloodflies, and Bloatfly Swarm. Now it's never a janky tribal deck without seeing some familiar changelings, but we're only running 3. I like to keep the deck mostly bug themed without relying on changelings too much since they feel like a cop-out. Anyways, Realmwalker is an all-star, allowing us to choose a creature type and cast them from the top of our library. The most important part, we can look at the top card of our library at any time. We can better time our grist mills with this. Bloodline Pretender can quickly grow out of control as we get insect tokens from grist, play out our insects, or use our other token generators. Graveshifter, while not too strong, can get us either an alternate win condition, removal, mill creature, or really just whatever we have sitting in the graveyard when it enters. There are plenty of other insects in this deck, and most have some utility tied to them. Going over the rest of the categories for the deck, bugs will come back up, but this is when we start getting support from non-insects. Running only 30 lands can be brutal, but with a 3 CMC commander that can quickly grow its loyalty, we shouldn't need too much to execute our game plan. Still, some ramp is nice to have, or run out to more expensive insects, or maybe even a grist who's been killed a few times. However, we don't want to land our elves, instead we must be able to execute some aspect of the deck, whether it mills or helps us discard. Skull Prophet, a classic staple in Golgari's self-mill, being expensive, $2.31, is worth it since we have the option of tapping for our colors or we mill too. Drawing this late game isn't as good as some of our other mill cards, but it's enough worrying that we get to control when we mill those 2 cards, so it makes stacking the top card of our library that much easier. Shigeki, Jukai Visionary, can get out early, and the next turn mill us 4 and hopefully hit a land drop, all for us to drop him back on the battlefield next turn. So it mills us, while simultaneously ramping if we do hit that land. We could channel it to get back some key mill or win conditions we put in our graveyard late game. Really useful for the deck. Nantuko Elder, our most basic ramp card. It gives us 1 and a green. It's an insect. Moving on. I'm torn on Bramble Familiar being in the deck, but the ability to choose and discard a card to return itself to our hand and then cast the Venture side if we do have the mana later is nice. I can't stress enough how important discarding our dredge creatures can be, which we'll cover right now. Why do we need a discarder on creatures? Well, that's because inevitably we're going to draw our dredge creatures, that's why, I swear it just always happens. But, dredge aside, pitching other bugs from our hand into our yard means we can boost the -5 grist ability just over the limit we need to possibly kill someone. We don't run much only discard effects, since they're usually tied into ramp or an insect creature like the newly released Altanak, which can discard itself for us to get a land back. A similar creature, Gigapede, allows us to discard a card as long as it's in our yard to return to our hand. Pretty useful, even if we need the 5-mana 6/1 body with Shroud as a chump blocker. Tied into one of our lands, we have Gaia Reach Sanitarium that allows us to draw then discard a card. We need as much help as we can get if we're running only creatures, so we do have some lands able to assist us in our game plan, and Gaia Reach is towards the top of that list. Sadistic Hypnotist falls into not 1 but 2 categories, discard and sacrifice. We'll slot it here, but keep in mind this achieves both for getting our graveyard filled in a pinch. Sadistic Hypnotist was one of the cards I saw when I first started playing Magic, so it has a special place in my Dimir heart. Bias aside, it was hard to justify not slotting it, especially with all these bug tokens we keep making. I'd say this is not a hard win condition of the deck, but is most certainly a need-to-be-answered creature when we play it. By sacrificing all the bug tokens that the deck makes, or Grist ends up making, we can make the entire table eventually discard their hands. I keep mentioning them, so now it's time to discuss our dredge cards. We're running 5, but only 1 is an insect. I'd say it's worth the non-insects, especially for Golgari, Grave Troll, and Stinkweed Imp. If I had to cut one, Golgari Thug probably leaves, but even then when it dies it gets back a creature card from our yard on top of the library, so it's not too bad. When we draw dredge cards, our priority is usually to get them into the yard as fast as possible to assist Grist. Discard is the fastest way, but playing them and sacrificing them works too. If we're doing good on the self-mill, we can always opt for just using them as chump blockers, especially in the case of Stinkweed Imp. Side note, love that this card is so old it doesn't have the keyword DeckTech on it, since it was before they made it a keyword. We only have a few ways to sacrifice in this deck, but they're useful. Before we start, remember, our commander is a sack outlet too. Her -2 requires us to sacrifice a creature to destroy a creature or planeswalker. It can come in handy for when we need to pitch something into the yard. From our insects, we have Devouring Swarm and Nantuko Husk. If our opponents aren't paying attention, we can sneak in some damage in one of these and just pump it to the moon by sacking a ton of bugs, or maybe even surprise opponent with a huge blocker. Next, we have Grim Backwoods. It's a rather desperate sack outlet, but being tied to a land and drawing a card is better than nothing. The mana cost is steep, but I've found that some games, by playing a cheap Golgari Thug, sacrificing it for a card, and then milling for 4 next turn just to rinse and repeat, got the job done. One of our MDFCs, Disciple of Fraelis, is an expensive 3 green 3/3 creature MDFC, and potentially one of our biggest one-shot mill effects in the deck. When it enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice a creature you control. You then gain X life and draw X, where X is its power. We have some huge creatures in the deck, larger than just a 9/9 or 5/5 base stats, since they grow with our graveyard. These next few are cards that we consider sacrificing to Disciple of Fraelis, but also are just really good beaters since they grow themselves. Sewer Nemesis is a card I've considered cutting, but it still does quite a few things for us. We select ourselves when it enters, and its power toughness becomes equal to our graveyard. What's interesting is that it's our entire graveyard, not just creatures in it. Plus, it helps itself grow when we cast a new spell, milling us for just a single card. It's better than nothing. Another one that gets huge with our graveyard, Old Stick Fingers, is X Black-Green Star Horror, where its power and toughness are equal to the number of creatures in our graveyard. What's great about Stick Fingers is with the amount of mana we pour into X, we reveal cards from the top of our library until we put X creature cards into the graveyard. Unfortunately, we don't mill the lands, we just put them on the bottom of the library in a random order. We don't only need the graveyard. In Bloodline Pretender's case, it can grow to a huge creature when we select Insect, and sees all the tokens Grist makes from our +1 ability, or any of our token generators for that matter. Just to recap, these could be great beaters or defenders, but using that Disciple of Fraelis can draw us an insane amount of cards, and since our maximum hand size is 7, we can easily fill up our graveyard with the creatures we want. Speaking of the creatures we want, next we have our mill creatures. Starting again with our impactful insects, we have Carrion Grub and Molegraph Millipede, both milling us for a set amount. Wanting to point out in Molegraph Millipede's case, it's another great contender to sacrifice to the Disciple, since it can easily grow itself out of control, while Carrion Grub's power is tied to just the highest power among creatures in our graveyard. Either way, both make great stat lines usually, and overall solid cards to the deck list. Zask Skittering Swarmlord has certainly dropped in price since release, now clocking in with around $3. Zask is amazing if we can get it on the field, with its ability for us to play lands and cast insects from our yard. A fun interaction, when any of our insect tokens die with Zask on the field, it flat out mills us for 2 cards, since we can't put the insect tokens back into the deck. Side note, don't forget the last ability, 1 in Golgari, that can give an insect Death Touch. Really underrated part of the card in a budget deck that needs to protect its commander. If you played Standard recently, you'll know what Aftermath Analyst is, but if not, it's a 2-mana 1/3 that mills us for 3 when it enters. Later, for 3 and a green, we can sack Aftermath and return all our lands from the graveyard to the battlefield tapped. A wonderful way to get back some of our utility lands if we end up accidentally milling, and one of our only few ways of doing so. So, all in all, this card mills us a bit, can sack itself, and eventually get a ton of lands back from our graveyard. Solid addition in my opinion, despite not being a bug. The next 2 cards mill us at the start of a turn, Splinter Fright and Nyx Weaver. Once again, both non-insects, but milling ourselves for 2 every turn is fine, not that bad, but both have more utility to them. Well, in Splinter Fright's case, it's a huge body with trample. Thank God, finally some trample. With a creature that's power toughness are each equal to the number of creature cards in our graveyard, this is one of our premier beaters for that alone, and it can end games pretty well. Hell, I'd say it's almost one of the alternate win conditions for the deck. While I really like Splinter Fright, bonus points for that sick art, thanks Innistrad, Nyx Weaver isn't terrible. A mediocre baseline, being a 2/3, but it has reach. Later, we can pay 1 black-green to get any card from our graveyard back to our hand. Spiders aren't insects though. While it may be obvious saying that, it's something just to keep in mind when you're new to piloting the deck and you're just looking at card arts while milling. The mill MVP A 4-cent card from Murderers at Karlov Manor for just a single black is Snarling Gorehound. This card is amazing in the deck, since we have a lot of creatures of power 2 or less. Roughly 44 creatures in the deck are below power 2. But that's not why it's amazing. It's the synergy it has with our commander's +1 ability that really makes his Hound go above and beyond. Let's say we mill 4 cards of Grist, which is 4 insect tokens. Since Grist's ability says repeat this process for her +1 ability, Gorehound's trigger will resolve from the stack after Grist is done milling and making the tokens. That means we get 4 surveil triggers, which we can pitch all those cards into the yard, essentially doubling how much Grist is milled for us. Or we can find a land or a useful creature to keep on top of our deck for the next turn. While this does work with Grist, keep in mind it still works with our other token generators too. While we do have to work for it a bit, Gorehound remains top dog for our mill creatures. We've seen a lot of graveyard recursion already, from Shigeki to Nyxweaver. Nothing in our graveyard is ever really lost to us with so many options to get it back. These next 2 creatures are specifically for recursion, starting with Genesis. Genesis, a 5-mana 4/4 incarnation, has, at the beginning of your upkeep, if Genesis is in your graveyard, you may pay 2 to green. If you do, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. I'd say this is similar to our dredge cards, we want it in the graveyard. When we do, we now have the option for repeatable creature recursion from our graveyard for only 3 mana. Some fun creatures you can loot this way is our Haywire Mite and Caustic Caterpillar. Sacking them, and the next turn we can pay the mana, replay it, and destroy more of our opponent's things. Loaming Shaman is similar to how cards like Grave, Purge, and Footbottom Feast work in a standard Grist deck, except it's on a creature. The idea is we play Loaming Shaman, select all our insects from our yard, and reshuffle them back in. Granted, this may be heavily luck-based depending on how many cards we've milled that game and how many bugs we put back in. But no joke, I have milled 23 insects in a row after playing this card and using Grist's +1 ability, and I'm still chasing that high. I can see this not making the cut, but give it a try and see if you can make it work. Our final topic for this video before we wrap things up is our alternate win conditions. Despite that $50 budget restriction and being all creatures, I think there's plenty of ways to win in the deck, but these 2, sadly non-insect creatures, is our best game plan for ending games besides our commander. Sir Conrad the Grim and Mirkwood Bats are great ways for our deck to keep lowering the table's life total bit by bit. I'd say Sir Conrad is the strongest of the 2, while Bats are more or less a complement to Grist's ability to generate insect tokens. Between these 2, they cover the bases pretty well for what our deck does. Sir Conrad deals 1 damage to each of the opponent for the following. Whenever another creature dies, a creature card is put into the graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, like milling a creature. And a creature card leaves our graveyard. Conrad is amazing anti-graveyard hate, especially if we have a lot of creatures in our yard, let's say roughly 20 or so, and someone Majuka Bogs us. The table is going to get pinged that 1 damage 20 times since we had 20 creature cards leave our graveyard. Being exiled, that is. Bats don't ping, but instead drains the life table for 1, there is a small distinction, whenever we create or sacrifice a token. If we have one of our token makers out, this can quickly get out of hand, especially if we have one of our sack outlets, like the previously mentioned Devouring Swarm or Nantuko Husk, allowing us to sack all our creature tokens at once at instant speed to drain the table for a huge amount of damage. Well, that's it for our first Sunken savings. Thanks for watching till the end. The deck list is posted in the description below as always. When viewing this deck list, make sure to change the TCG prices. Personally, this deck has crawled up my list of favorite decks, and I hope you enjoy playing it too. If you have a budget Grist deck or a Grist deck, share below of how you build her. I love hearing ideas or maybe about a card that I missed in the deck list. I might eventually do the all insect meme deck list and see how well it goes. And with that, I'll see you next time.